Okay. Well, welcome everyone today to the first kickoff of the PGH.AI Speaker Series program. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with PGH.AI, hello, and let me help you get a little more familiar with it. My name is Jennifer Apicella, and I am currently the director. And PGH.AI is a volunteer community-led organization. And I'm not going to read the slide here. You can see it for yourself. But basically, the heart and soul of what we're trying to do here is provide opportunities to demystify or destigmatize some of the topics and some of the, I think, areas of concern and interest around artificial intelligence and machine learning technology. As you know, this is an area of innovation and advancement right now, and there's a lot of confusion and misinformation, and it sort of is all dependent on different technologies and industry areas. So we are very gingerly trying to, do what we can to make these types of topics and discussions a little more open and generalized to the public. And we try and do that with a variety of different programs, this being one of them, our speaker series. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. PGH.AI is an initiative of the organization PART. PART is the Partnership to Advance Responsible Technology. It's a nonprofit, cross-sector sort of think tank, and we are sort of the programmatic arm of that. So we hope to, in 2021, kick off a lot more exciting activities and opportunities. If you want to get more involved with PGH.AI, we would love that. We need as many people to help support this type of thing. Like I said, this is a volunteer grassroots community initiative. And so we have a monthly newsletter that goes out. So if you check your chat, you should be able to subscribe to that. There's the link there. Just sign up so you can receive that. Lots of fun and exciting updates. If you'd like to get more involved, we have a robust and exciting volunteer program. So we have different volunteer opportunities at all different levels, at all different areas of how much time you can contribute. And then also, in addition to this speaker series, we also have other opportunities. So if you have something that is around responsible technology, AI, machine learning, things of that nature that you'd like to speak about, we also have a speaker forum. You can submit yourself, or if you know of someone that you've heard that has said something around these topics, definitely nominate them or share the link with them. We'd love to hear from them and see if we can't incorporate them into our program. And so we'll have more information on future scheduling and future speakers releasing in the weeks as well. Okay, that's enough of that. PGH.AI, we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out, follow us on social as well. We're on all the platforms. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let this fireside chat get started. Today's topic is the sword and the shield and how government use of technology can help or harm the public. We have our fantastic feature we are featuring Stephen Caines, but I'm going to turn this actually over to one of our PGH.AI ambassadors. Go ahead and stop sharing. And Eugene Leventhal. Eugene, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Stephen, and today's topic, please.
Perfect. Thanks so much for kicking this off, Jen. So as was mentioned, welcome everyone, first of all, to today's event. I'm a recent addition to the PGH.AI family, acting as an ambassador here, where I'm helping to build out this speaker series. So if this is something you want to chat about more specifically, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm definitely happy to connect. But outside of PGH.AI, I actually work within the city at Carnegie Mellon as a project manager, where I'm involved in a tech-related podcast called Consequential, as well as supporting the CyLab Institute of Security and Privacy there. But the focus of today really is this discussion that we're going to be having with Stephen, and we really appreciate Stephen being the first of our speakers in this larger series that we're kicking off. Next month, we will most likely be having a more healthcare-focused discussion. There will be some more information coming out in the next week or so on that. But for today, again, we're just really happy that Stephen could join us. And to give some more information on Stephen and his background, he is a second-year residential fellow at CodeX and a legal technologist with a passion for privacy and access to justice. His work primarily focuses on facial recognition used by governments and law enforcement, as well as examining the impacts of other emerging technologies. Stephen is a co-founder of the Corona Atlas Dashboard, which is a free pandemic resource open to the general public, and he currently serves on the San Jose Digital Privacy Advisory Task Force. His work has been featured in Forbes, Codex's Future Law Conference, the World Economic Foundation, and in addition to a number of podcasts and speaker series such as this one. Stephen holds a JD from the University of Miami School of Law with a concentration in business of innovation, law, and technology. Again, thank you, Stephen, so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Huge thank you to Eugene, Jen, and the entire PGH.AI team. I was very excited to come speak to you guys here today because I feel that the mission of PGH.AI, bridging the gap between technologists and the community, is so important. So I'm so glad you guys created a forum for everybody to come together.
Thank you. And I just want to quickly mention before we actually start our discussion, please keep in mind that for Q&A, please feel free to drop in questions in the chat as we go. We will address those at the end. We definitely will leave some time open so that anyone can jump in and ask questions. But while we're speaking, just please drop them into the chat. And then at the end, once we actually open it up for more public Q&A, at that point, we will allow people to go off of mute and get on mic and actually ask a question directly if you're so inclined. But yeah, please don't be shy with dropping stuff in the chat for now. But yeah, so the title of the discussion that we're going to be having with Stephen today is The Sword and the Shield, How Government Use of Technology Can Help or Harm the Public. So, let's start off with the positive half of this. What do you, Stephen, what do you see as some of the potential ways that government use of tech can positively help?
Absolutely. So to first describe three large buckets, just to give you an overview of where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to discuss predictive analytics and algorithms, which is essentially using historical data to try to predict outcomes in the future. The second is going to be about digital equity and inclusion. So that's addressing how many Americans are underconnected to the internet, both in terms of access to physical hardware, then also high-speed broadband internet access that's connecting all of you beautiful people here today together. And then finally, also public interest technology. So these are organizations that exist for the public good, like legal aids that are doing really innovative things to help deliver services to often low-income, marginalized communities. So those are the three big topics I'm going to discuss in the positive use cases of government technology.
Great. And digging into the first one of those, the predictive analytics and algorithm side, do you mind just giving a definition and how kind of the predictive algorithms might be, or excuse me, the predictive analytics might be different than algorithms and AI and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Predictive analytics is a little bit more narrow, where AI is a very general description. So in terms of predictive analytics, you can kind of think of it as your traditional statistical and mathematical computations. It could involve AI, but it could also not. Your meteorologist that is predicting the weather is technically doing predictive analytics to an extent. And then also AI is a little bit larger. And so when you hear artificial intelligence, there's a lot of feelings that arise in a sense, but at its real core, it's trying to simulate human capabilities. So if you think of autonomous vehicles, it's trying to simulate computer vision specifically. And in this case of predictive analytics, you're trying to simulate human cognition and predicting future events. And so think of it as AI uses algorithms to create a model that's of greater sophistication as compared to just traditional quantitative methods like analytics. And at times AI can have greater accuracy, but it's not always a guarantee. So keep in mind, AI does not always equal pure efficiency.
And do you mind providing some examples with what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And throughout today's chat, I'll be dropping some links throughout in the chat. So the first project that I want to showcase is out of Georgia Tech in Atlanta, specifically in the area of predicting which properties should be inspected for fire violations to help reduce not only the loss of life, but also economic loss of property. So this project is called Firebird. And essentially, they merged a bunch of data sets together, including police fire records and other municipality things in public record, to essentially develop a predictive model that could assign a risk score to individual properties, and also design this like really interactive map that helps you kind of map out which property should be inspected first. And so the benefit of this is that, you know, fatal accidents happen, unfortunately, all too commonly. And given that cities are really restrained in the amount of resources and budget allocation that they have to address these issues, they need to ensure that they're getting a high amount of return in terms of which properties that they specifically investigate. And as you mentioned before, I serve on San Jose's Digital Privacy Task Force. An example from San Jose is, oh, apologies, I didn't drop the first one. Let me scroll back up. Okay, so here's the link to Firebird. And then the second project, San Jose Code Enforcement. Very similarly, they had a series of fatal accidents in San Jose involving properties that should have been inspected and potentially condemned. And they essentially built a predictive model that before they had 44% accuracy, but after they use AI, they got that up to 77%. So we're really seeing how AI can really help government deliver services. And especially now when municipalities are really strapped for money in terms of the impacts of COVID, it's important that we utilize and marshal our resources accordingly. So just a few other key things is, in addition to identifying specific properties, they also find certain nuances in the data. And this is also another key power of predictive analytics and algorithms. Like, they were able to determine that other factors that could indicate if a property should be condemned or inspected included the time since last inspection, violation rates of nearby property, and also the presence of other healthy and safe violations. So I think that predictive analytics is something that is present in many institutions and will continue to expand. And the benefit is that it saves not only lives, but also large amounts of fiscal resources. And then just the final thing I want to shine a light on in this area is the fact of open data. The only way that you can achieve specifically predictive analytics and algorithms at this scale is if you have a large amount of data. And so a lot of cities are trying to make their data a lot more democratized. And so in your city of Pittsburgh, they have a tool called Bird's Eye View, which has a very interesting interactive map that shows you everything from just government services to 311 requests to arrests and things of this nature. So you might be able to embark on your own predictive analytics journey. And you know, if this is an area that interests you, I encourage you to just take a Coursera course or something similar to that online. It's not as difficult as you think, and with the wealth of data just being produced, it's very easy to get an interactive and innovative project off the ground.
Yeah, and you know, as you mentioned, between the fact that both the predictive analytics and some of the more algorithmic sort of both of these tools already are finding their way into both public and private use cases. And as you were just mentioning, the fact that there's so many opportunities for individuals to get personally involved, whether it's just working on public data sets or even getting into the actual more algorithm structuring or whatever it might be. A question that comes to mind is, you know, is there anything that people should be keeping in mind when it comes to thinking about predictive analytics overall?
Definitely. From an experimental design part, the first question you should ask is, where is this data coming from? One of the reasons why I highlighted those two specific projects is because they come from public records, so the privacy concerns are relatively minimal. But let's say you're doing predictive analytics on health data, you need to ask yourself, you know, have you gotten consent to use this data? Should it be anonymized, you know, before it's processed or afterwards, in order to best protect the patient data that's at focus? And then also I want to highlight that predictive analytics can in certain areas have some negative consequences, and we find that predictive policing is an area that people have tried to venture into for like the last few decades, and that can also be very problematic due to the way that many law enforcement organizations and agencies in the US maintain their data. And so it's found that predictive analytics, when applied to the criminal justice realm, can exacerbate current inequalities. So I would view that if you are considering using predictive analytics, try to use publicly available data that's for a relatively neutral or objectively good purpose, and just be cognizant of what some of the underlying consequences could be.
Got it. Thank you for giving that breakdown of the first of the three buckets in terms of predictive analytics and algorithms. And I guess now kind of pivoting to the second one, which is digital equity, inclusion, and the digital divide. Do you mind just providing a little more color about what you see as part of this bucket?
Absolutely. in terms of opportunity in today's ecosystem, access to internet is paramount, especially with the pandemic. And so when you have underconnected households, which tend to also come from many low-income communities in many cities, it's vital that people not only have hardware to access the internet, hopefully one per person in the household, but also access to broadband high-speed internet so they're able to stream videos and things like that. And so there is a very clear correlation between access to internet and also access to opportunity. So whether it's your child needing to connect to a Zoom school, or you're trying to start like an Etsy store or give guitar lessons over Zoom, it's very key that you have kind of that stability. And even though kind of a little sometimes American ideology trends to you being independent, government services really should help extend that bridge and essentially close gaps between inequality in their communities by ensuring that they have a robust digital infrastructure. So the goal of digital equity and inclusion is that. It's also sometimes phrased as closing the digital divide, but all those concepts are relatively synonymous.
Got it. And let's shift then to also the third bucket, which is on the public interest technology side. And there might be some link, especially when we think of the government kind of housing these or elsewhere. So what do you define as public interest tech?
And if I could actually go back 1 second to the digital equity and inclusion, if you don't mind, just to give a few examples. So San Jose has a digital inclusion fund specifically. And so there they were trying to reduce the digital divide in their communities. And so 95,000 residents in that city lack internet access. 55% of them are low income. And their fund, essentially, it established 24 million to invest over the next 10 years. And so from the current numbers recently released from the CIO, 67,000 students at the beginning of the pandemic lacked internet access, and they now have that to only about 7,000. So they're able to greatly reduce that disparity. And so that also helps with preventing students from falling behind, which will pay dividends in the future. Another thing I'd just like to briefly highlight is that in Seattle, they don't only have kind of government initiatives, but they're also providing government funding to nonprofit organizations that are also trying to do the same thing. So whether you're just giving out broadband hotspots to people, or you're helping refurbish devices so that they're able to be used again, that's something that goes into that mission of digital equity and inclusion. So if any of you are interested, I'd advise you to look to your local governments and also state governments to see if there's any initiatives around that to get involved. And also, it's been indicated by the Biden administration that that will be a priority for them moving forward, specifically closing the digital divide and advancing digital equity.
Yeah, thank you. And it'll definitely be very interesting to see how things change in this regard in the coming year or so with the new administration coming in. And so, now kind of segueing to the third bucket, with the first one being the predictive analytics, the second one being much more digital equity inclusion. This third one is public interest technology. So what do you mean by that, public interest tech?
So public interest tech can just largely be described as any organization that exists for the benefit of the general good, that is utilizing technology. So when I say that government is considered public interest, but also things like domestic violence shelters, charities, nonprofits, legal aids, those are all considered within the public interest space because they exist for the general benefit of the public. So when I was in law school, I was able to work at the legal services of Greater Miami. And essentially it's the largest legal aid in South Florida. So they do everything from like consumer debt to bankruptcy to all these kind of a wide range of activities. And so I was able to help on a project which built an online intake system that connected 3 legal aids throughout the state, which represented a large population of Florida. And in addition to allowing a method for people to apply online 24/7, even if there wasn't someone by the phone, it also allowed us to easily transfer cases in between these different institutions. And one of the lessons that I learned from that process is that there's a lot of distrust and at times, valid animosity towards the legal system in this country for, legitimate grievances. But also some of that frustration sometimes comes from when service providers are not able to provide services in the most efficient manner. It's very unfortunate when you have to turn someone away, but if you can't give them another direction to go to, and in terms just like redirecting them, that also adds to the frustration. So I think it's important to remember that if you're working with a nonprofit or you're working with these organizations and institutions, it's on you to also still provide a high level of service. And if you can help them, accurately direct them to someone that can, in a sense. So that was just one major takeaway that I got from that. And if anybody's interested about reading more about that project, here's an in-depth 29-page final report specifically about that project, connecting the different legal aids throughout Florida. But that mostly wraps up my positive use cases of technology. I think you are muted, Eugene.
Yeah, it would be helpful to unmute. And before we do transition, is there anything else that should be mentioned in terms of the ways that governments might be able to use tech in a helpful way?
Uh, in a sense, I think that it's always a balancing act between getting kind of community input and support, and then also kind of having the right people in the right place to lead these initiatives. I think that, having, like, in the market, you might call that like a product market fit, but I think it's almost talent project fit, almost, if you will, in this new age. So I think that there's a lot of talented people out there that are kind of straying away from government work and government initiatives for, a plethora of reasons. But I think that having really motivated people that care and can listen to the people in their community for input is so vital. So I think that when I see the best executed project design, it has like a wide group of stakeholders, but it also has really key members of a team that can execute. So those are the things I look out for in like positive use cases of technology.
Got it. Thank you for outlining those three areas and providing some examples there. And just a quick check-in for everyone. So we're kind of transitioning to the second part of the fireside chat, where we're going to talk about some of the potential harms. And I just want to remind everyone that please feel free to drop in questions that might be coming up in the chat as we're going along, and we will open up at the end again for folks to have a chance to ask questions then. And so, as we are kind of changing tracks from the positive ways of potentially helping to more of ways that there can be potential harm, what do you see at a high level the ways that government use of tech can potentially harm the public?
Yeah, so there are many ways, but for today's discussion, I'll try to focus in on two. And the first is the use of emerging technologies without sufficient safeguards, oversight, and kind of robust testing. And the second bucket that I'll address today is cybersecurity concerns, specifically when our data, our tools fall into the hands of people who wish to do us harm, in a sense, and there's a lot of consequences behind that.
Got it. And starting off on the emerging technology side, then, yeah, can you give a sense of kind of what you're thinking about in that bucket in general?
Definitely. So one area of specialty of mine is the use of facial recognition specifically. And just to really boil it down to a basic definition, if you might be unfamiliar, facial recognition technology is essentially comparing one image that you might call a probe image or an input image to a database to determine whether that face matches. So you're trying to match that human ability to match faces, which from a cognitive standpoint is actually pretty well functioning, in the sense of, like, you can see someone when you're a child and then see them like decades later and still remember who they are. So you're trying to mimic that essential feature. One quick note that I'd like to raise as a distinction is what's known as face ID, let's say within the iPhone, or when you have, quote, facial recognition within your phone, actually differs from what you might have seen on TV or what for the police use, in a sense. And so if you're using it on your phone, it's actually known as facial verification, and that's known as a one-to-one analysis. And so there you have a passport style photo, which is when you originally scan your face in like a very, what we consider optimal conditions. So great lighting, neutral face, and things of that nature. And you're just kind of comparing that one-to-one, saying that, is this in fact, let's say Eugene, if it's Eugene's phone, and then one-to-many you use, which is this later image, which is, sorry, the later use case where, let's say, the CSI Minority Report, where it's like you have a crowd of people and you just have a side profile shot, then you identify it. So those are technically two distinct processes. One is facial verification, facial recognition. Facial verification actually tends to be marginally more accurate for a variety of reasons, but one of the key ones is that the probe images are a lot clearer, and they just have a greater integrity, if you will, in that sense. But there are many issues with facial recognition. The first major issue that a lot of people address is misidentifications. And so it's been shown historically that facial recognition struggles to perform on the very young, the very old, women, and minorities. And I know that minorities would tend to think, Black people, Asian people, but also keep in mind, other minorities like Native Americans, who are just traditionally underrepresented in so many different arenas. So people of those natures tend to be very more readily misidentified by the technology. And advocates have been warning about this potential for years. And now we're starting to see a lot of like bright line cases kind of pop up. So in Detroit this past summer, there were two men who were arrested separately on completely separate charges, arrested and detained wrongfully based on the use of facial recognition technology. And the reason why we haven't seen this, I think, much more in a clear fashion before is because facial recognition is also used in conjunction with a variety of other investigative techniques. So it's most readily apparent that facial recognition is being used in a poor manner when essentially it's the sole piece of evidence, and that's what we saw in those two cases. They had nothing else connecting those two men except a probe image that wrongly identified that it was those specific individuals. So misidentifications have a lot of real tangible harm. It's not just like, oh, we got it wrong. It's like, one of the guys was arrested in front of his children and wrongfully detained. Like, those are things that can kind of scar you. So it's very important that if we ever use emerging technologies that we check it, and it's not something that I really see in facial recognition. And also keep in mind that it's not one technology. There are literally hundreds, and I'm sure in the future, like thousands of vendors of facial recognition technology across the globe, each with kind of their own processes, both in terms of how well that they tested it and developed the algorithms, but then also in terms of the deployment. And another thing I'd like to highlight in this area is that it's not always guaranteed it's going to work. In San Diego, they deployed a facial recognition system for 7 years, and a spokesperson for the system said that, to her knowledge, it had never actually produced a suspect for an investigation. And then finally, I'd like to highlight that this is a highly unregulated area and industry there's some very dishonest practices. Facial recognition right now is being highly marketed to schools specifically, arguing that they can stop school shootings. And they specifically use images from Sandy Hook and Parkland in their advertising to kind of produce a shock value. But there's little to no empirical evidence that facial recognition, in fact, stops violence within schools. And that's part of the age issue of identifying the very young. And then separately, they operate off a flagging system. So essentially you have to identify someone as a person, as a probable individual for committing some violent act, and then essentially it acts as an alert system, but it has never once been proven to actually prevent school violence. There are other methods like weapons detection systems, or even separately just investing in school psychiatrists, which could really produce a benefit. So asking yourself, even if your intentions are good, that you want to reduce, let's say, negative outcomes in schools, I think that it's very key to ask yourself, what are the alternative means to reach this goal? Is this really the best means to doing so, or are we just looking for a quick and dirty solution in a sense? So the use of emerging technologies, both in terms of surveillance tech, but even more largely, just the US government has deployed a lot of technology that wasn't exactly ready. And just as another brief note, misidentifications also occur because the data that it was trained on, so for facial recognition, you need to train on thousands, if not millions of photos, often does not represent the target environment where it's deployed. And so in this sense, you might have a database that's primarily trained on a bunch of white faces, and then it's deployed in, let's say, a low-income neighborhood, primarily consisting of Black people. And so that's also why you see some of those issues.
And I know in general, when we've discussed this topic in the past, the idea of mission creep has come up. Do you mind mentioning what you see, how you define mission creep, and how that's relevant here?
Definitely. So mission creep largely recognizes that when technology is offered or deployed in a certain environment, over time, it tends to also be stretched to other arenas. So for instance, license plate readers are essentially the scanning devices that can automatically record your license plate. And so this can often be used to prove that you were in fact at a certain location. And so when they first developed license plate readers, it was argued that it would solely be used to find missing children and stolen vehicles. And these are things that I don't think anybody really objects to in a sense. But then they were later used by ICE to find undocumented persons. So it's really key to note that when these technologies are being offered, even if it sounds for the most, righteous and valid cause, like always ask yourself, what would happen if this technology was abused specifically? And this new era of biometric identification with the biometric capture of certain physiological features kind of creates a whole new host of new risks that we see. So it's very key to note that mission creep is always possible, even if someone's telling you that it's only going to be for this purpose, unless they put that into some type of law or ordinance, which has its own host of issues there's always a question of it kind of going past. And in San Francisco specifically, they banned the use of facial recognition by government agents and entities. And there is a current concern that it was actually used in deploying, essentially researching and investigating gun case specifically in San Francisco. So I'll drop a link to the chat there. And there it was an external source, but the way that they often draft ordinances is that saying that that the police departments cannot either have the technology in-house or they cannot request it from external organizations. And there's a question here as to whether they requested it or if it was even sent to them, should they have used that information? So looking at ordinances and prohibitions of technologies, they have to be very well crafted in a sense.
Interesting. And so to kind of focus in on the second of the two areas that you wanted to highlight in terms of potential areas of harm, do you mind defining what you see as the main areas within the world of cybersecurity threats that are relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to be clear, cybersecurity is by no means my main specialty, but I'm just familiar with it in terms of data breaches in that sense. So I see that the breach of data about individuals is one major concern. There's a voter record breach, I believe, a few years ago, where like over 100 million voters' information was just publicly made available. So there's data about individuals. There's also tools that happen to be breached. Just to scroll back to the individuals part, Customs and Border Protection actually had a breach of their facial recognition system a few years ago, and specifically thousands of travelers' photos were released on the internet, and advocacy groups actually found some of them on the dark web. So when you build a lot of these systems, aside from asking, is this useful, do we need it, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen if this information gets leaked? And I feel like that is one thing that's not really addressed, and we're not ensuring that there's robust safeguards to specifically determine that we're ensuring people's data is protected in a sense. And I think that there's a little bit of a tendency, specifically at borders, because often people argue that individuals who are not from this country do not have the same rights as people within this country, that it's okay to essentially have biometric identification that you would never have at a city level deployed at the border specifically for that purpose. And I find that to be a little objectionable, both on like a more unethical plane. So that's one key thing to know. And then the second thing I want to highlight is that we've all noticed that a lot of these data breaches and hacks have become a lot more prominent and frequent. And in addition to more people having access to the internet, and in theory, more malicious actors out there, I want to highlight that in 2016, an NSA tool, and the NSA is the National Security Agency, the same agency that had the scandal with the phone tapping and the whole Edward Snowden stuff, this tool is stolen from them called Eternal Blue. And Eternal Blue essentially is this tool developed, oh, sorry, apologies, wrong. Actually, no, correct link, sorry. It was this tool that was developed as a security exploit. And so it's been used against independent municipalities, cities like Baltimore, and also things like hospitals and other institutions, specifically in ransomware attacks, to essentially hold data hostage or access to information hostage. And so often these people will approach you, and you'll just be locked out of your system one day. They'll say you have to pay, let's say 10 Bitcoin to this specific wallet, and if not, we're going to erase everything. And so one reason why these have become more frequent is actually tools that our government built in benefit for our defense have been being deployed by bad actors. So when we build these tools, again, ask yourself, what's the worst case that could happen if this falls into the wrong hands? And that's what we're seeing today. So you have to ask yourself what other tools and information have been released in that manner. And then the other thing I just want to highlight very quickly is just a random blog post that details some of the biggest data breaches within the US government. I think that it's just very key to highlight that a lot of information has been lost over the last few years, and compounded, this will produce some really bad outcomes in the future. So in addition to determining what technology to build, also ask, are we taking adequate precautions to protect it?
Absolutely. And thank you for providing that overview too. And we definitely want to transition more to an open Q&A portion. So please feel free to drop in questions in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. And Stephen, if you don't mind, just quickly dropping information where people can kind of learn more about some of your work and stay in touch with you beyond today. Yeah, please feel free to drop that in the chat before we get into the questions.
Absolutely. I just dropped my personal website, my email, and then also if you can find me on Twitter at AutoJurist.
Perfect. And yeah, so again, please feel free to drop in questions. And I'm actually going to drop in two podcast episodes relating to topics that we just talked about. The first one specifically about the Eternal Blue hacks, and the second one with a specific example of Clearview AI, which I know we didn't get into today, but was something we talked about offline. And I think while just waiting for any others to come up with questions, I wanted to kind of dig in a little more to this whole idea of when technology is kind of just emerging, it's coming up, it's something new. when it used to be that there was a massive physical infrastructure required, when there was so much overhead to the research that, only governments or actors of a certain size can do it. And now all of a sudden, and as was discussed in that Clearview AI episode, one person can just take an algorithm and start applying it in all kinds of different areas, especially if they convince others to be able to get access to data that they, arguably might not deserve kind of to have access to that, or at least public citizens should be aware of that. Do you think things have kind of changed so much from the development and release of new emerging tech that it is just completely a different ballgame in terms of trying to oversee and police, and this is something we're going to have to figure out on the fly? Or is this just kind of an innovation that involves experimentation and it's not a lost cause yet?
I do think that we need to have some radical reform in how we view these technologies. I think that like to give an example, when we talk about Section 230, I think it's like a little bit ridiculous that we're comparing it to newspapers, but that, being trained in law, that's what we do, right? We draw examples from the past, try to make it analogous to the present, and then we hope that what comes out the other end is something that everybody can live with, but we're seeing that that's not sustainable. I think that we're really in a new era where a lot of data, information, and individuals are convalescing at one point. And if we don't kind of have what you were essentially addressing in that question, kind of new radical lines be redrawn, I think is very key. And I think that the other thing is that we cannot look at specific use cases of technology in a vacuum. One really interesting question someone asked me recently was regarding the Capitol riots and whether we should have used Clearview AI to identify those protesters. So I am not a fan of Clearview AI for a variety of reasons. They have made, numerous misstatements to the public, misleading, and, some might call outright lies. I think that the way that they collected their data is not something that's ethical, even if it was technically legal under a certain lens. But at the real heart of it, it was that facial recognition technology may be used on lawful gatherings, which I'm not, and as compared to the unlawful gathering and insurrection attempts of January 6th. And I also want to highlight here, though, that although I would like to say like we should not have used facial recognition in that situation, I think the time was of the essence. I think that between January 6th and 20th, we had information that more tangible threats existed to prevent the inauguration, and that where time is of the essence, it may be valid to use some of those advanced technologies. So when we talk about like outright bans, while I do hear a lot of the concerns of the civil rights activists and community, and I definitely agree, and being a member of an underrepresented minority and population that would specifically be misidentified myself, I do hear many of the concerns, but I do feel that there are isolated cases where some bounds around the technology must be drawn. And so I think that it's really key to keep in mind that if you say that you can use it here in this situation, be sure that you can have a set of frameworks so you can say in the next scenario, if it is a lawful protest and not what we saw on January 6th, that facial recognition technology is prohibited then. So don't just look at things as an instance by instance value, kind of in a vacuum. Try to understand how do we, I guess, promote a long-standing framework that future consequences can be judged against in like a similar manner.
Got it. And turning to some of the questions that are coming in. So the first one, and Matt, please feel free to jump in if there's any additional color to mention here, but what are the legal resources available for someone who is trying to hold municipalities more accountable?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have anything to add to that, Matt?
No, just, yeah, nothing really to add.
Yeah, and just to clarify, when you say holding them accountable, is it for cybersecurity risks or the deployment of technology that's not ready that produces tangible harm?
I think that both really the deployment with more of what I was thinking, as well as, I guess, if data, in order data should be transparent. I think that one of the things, and a lot of times municipalities don't want that data to be transparent. So there can be a struggle to gain access to that data, and the struggle seems a little bit stacked if there's lots of lawyers on one side and someone's alone on the other side.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. And one thing that I come up across against a lot is like FOIA requests. So if you're unfamiliar, FOIA stands for the Freedom of Information Accountability Act, I believe. And essentially, these are requests that you can make to government agencies to relinquish information. And often they're met with responses that this is a huge undue burden, that it'll take too much time and resources. I think that some of the best levers for accountability is addressing who has ownership over certain projects and initiatives, and trying to hold their feet to the fire if that goes a different way in a sense. I think that making sure that we all participate in our local governments. Apologies for the noise, by the way, it's garbage day here, so that's what you're hearing outside. But essentially making sure that your represented officials are putting their names on projects and you're following up with them and ensuring that some of the transparency components that you're describing right now are being developed. I think also too, when I hear government agencies say, oh, we can't release this for privacy reasons, I think that they're often not making a genuine effort to try to make even just broad strokes readily apparent, right? So if we're saying something like, let's say, the housing examples that I used earlier, you don't have to tell me specifically which properties are condemned if that's not normally in the record, but you can tell me how efficient was this tool compared to previous methods, right? I think often we see this new thing of hey, we instituted this new web server and it got 30 people signed up, but what was it at rest, right? Before you implemented this, historically, how have we actually progressed, right? So not just judging a new initiative, but judging it against what was the status quo, I think is the best way to hold levers. It does get complicated though, if your data has been compromised by a municipality and you try to sue them in a sense. I'll admit that litigation is not my specialty in a sense, and often it can be a little bit of a losing battle, but the collective action of having people in your jurisdiction come together and advocate as a group, I think is one of the most powerful things that you can do.
Great. And another question that came in was, where might the lines be drawn between the private and public development and deployment of tech? For example, the question of internet access being regulated as a utility.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the first part of the question about lines being drawn between private and public development of technology, one area that I am consistently fascinated by is the procurement process. So by procurement, I just mean the way that agencies acquire new technologies, resources, and tools. Specifically, who is in that room when those conversations are being had, what questions are being made, and then also what representations are being made, I think is so key. And that's something that gets a little bit murky. I think that there's also a lot of sometimes conflicting interests, let's say, between sometimes our elected representatives and certain financial and vending aspects in that regard. So I guess the question of internet access being regulated as a utility, I would agree personally, as my own personal judgment. I think access to internet is essentially a human right. I think that we live in a world where, in a sense, being deprived of the internet access absolutely is a significant kind of taking of a right in a sense. And so I think that I would personally like to see more investment by the local, state, and federal level into digital equity by ensuring that communities that have historically had low access to broadband internet receive that. And there are a few methods of people doing that, right? You have Google with their Loon initiative, where they're putting high balloons in the atmosphere that specifically beam down broadband internet. There are a lot of interesting ways to go about that. But specifically the internet being internet access being regulated as a utility, I think that it gets a little bit murky when the government starts playing in that pool a little bit too much, but I think that they should invest in the infrastructure and then let the business kind of still sort itself out. So if you could bifurcate it, whereby you still invest in the infrastructure that everybody has access to, but maybe some of those high level services still are a little bit under the control of the private sector, that could have some benefit. But ensuring a robust access point is the number one thing in my mind.
Yeah, the internet as a utility especially is such a interesting question given the realities of today's life. And then what was the common adage of, there were two inevitables before of death and paying taxes, and now we're in a world where it's 3: death, paying taxes, and getting your email hacked at some point. And if it's so commonplace, it seems absurd that it doesn't the actual access to that tech isn't seen as an actual utility or human right even. But I don't want to take away from the public questions at the moment. So let me jump to the next one. Have laws and policies stayed up to pace with the rapid development of technology? If yes, should laws and policies try to be ahead of the pace? If no, what is needed for them to catch up?
That's a great question. And it links back to kind of some of my earlier comments as well. I think that the biggest disconnect is that our elected representatives at the federal level are much older than the people developing some of the most innovative technologies today. I think that having lived in also multiple parts of the US, I see the disconnect between kind of the West Coast tech scene and then also like the East Coast advocacy and government regulation. I see those communities as often very distinct, and I see like very little interaction kind of coming in between the two. And so if you go back to when Facebook and Google were having those Senate hearings, I was just amazed by some of the questions our elected representatives were asking, and how honestly some of them were a little bit basic in a sense and not that technically sound or robust, or like even if you had those representatives of those companies in that room, like why would you ask that specific question? So I think that the first issue is that the people that are making the decisions do not have the technical acumen needed to draft this legislation and regulation that is robust enough to respond to our present day issues. So I think it's largely a personnel issue first. So I think that by getting not even necessarily younger people, like they don't necessarily have to even be the elected representatives, but ensuring that they're there to advise and be a part of the process, but also making sure that lobbyists are not dominating this entire discussion. I see that as another possible issue, that lobbyists have also kind of warped the game a little bit in terms of exactly which initiatives get pushed and which measures are taken. So that's something that's on the top of my mind in a sense. But I think that having a greater connection between Washington and big tech is needed in a sense. Now, I know that kind of sounds a little bit also, that symbiotic relationship could have, the way that I'm suggesting, it could have some negatively intended consequences, but I think that technology will always lead law, but the gap should not be this big. I think it is inevitable that technical progress will go further than what we have for regulation, but I think that the gap that we have now is just far too large and is producing tangible harms. And so people are now making decisions and acting in a way that saying, this is completely legal. There's no law saying that I can't do it, but, as a result, many people are being harmed. So I think that, just trying to close that gap is very nascent and required for us to be able to catch up.
Awesome. And then another question that just came in is that it sounds like social or organizational factors such as values, talent, leadership, organizational management, accountability mechanisms, that all of those kinds of factors are much more critical to determining the help or harm than the specific capabilities of any component of technologies. From what you've observed, what are some of the key indicators that a municipal government is properly equipped or prepared to deploy novel technologies responsibly?
Absolutely. So Kenny, thank you for that great question. And I like what you've surmised from there. The one talent tool that I would add just to that first part of your question, though, is like empathy. I think that too often as people are trying to solve problems, we just hop in and want to start building. When I was in law school, I started working with the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. So they combat cyber sexual harassment and the people that spread like non-consensual pornography and things of that nature. So I remember when I first started with the organization, I was so eager, I was excited to get ready, but like I quickly realized that the best thing for me for at least my first few months would just be to shut up. Like as a man, describing issues that broadly affect many women, I realized that the first order of business was me to just shut up and listen to the manner in which ways that this is negatively impacting them, and then what are the ways that they would see this as a positive benefit, right? So I think that often there's major issues when people, that who are making like more than 150K say, poor people, this is what you need to do, right? Like I find that very problematic, and you're not actually listening to the communities in which you're trying to serve. So I think that also empathy and emotional intelligence is something that's like routinely overlooked and always pays dividends. But to the heart of your question, the key indicators that a municipal government is properly equipped. So first, I think that every major city should honestly have an Office of Technology and Innovation. San Jose, they got one, I believe, a few years ago. And I've been fortunate to know the former CIO and the current CIO and the deputy chief of staff just through my work on the task force. And a huge sign, if you are a major city, is that you're devoting resources to technology and innovation. You have people hired full-time thinking about these issues, and their main commitment is to the city. It's not to some other organization that are serving on a board, for instance, right? I think that the fact that you have people full-time on staff looking at these issues is very big. I think periodically releasing information about privacy, even if it shines like a negative light on how your city is underperforming, is huge. I think not just showing your highlights. I see a lot of cities and municipalities only posting when good things happen, but I think that it's a big measure of accountability for city can say, hey, we messed up, and we had this amount of unauthorized breaches, here's what we're doing to fix it, right? So what are the feedback loops in which you're engaging with your jurisdiction, your populace, that's not on an election year? Like too often it's politicized, but it's like progress should be relatively objective. And if you feel that your jurisdiction is openly communicating with you, to me, that's like a great sign in a sense. Like that is very, very critical. And then I think that just one more issue in terms of deployment of technology is that we find that police departments, they're often bifurcated from some of the decision making from the rest of the government in a sense. And I think that unless you know what all of your different city agencies are doing, it's hard to have a handle on it and then also be able to move forward. So when I see cities regularly having roundtables of different agencies and different departments, that's also a very positive sign to me that they're taking steps to proactively root out kind of these issues. So making sure that you have all the stakeholders at the table and you're not leaving out certain parts of the city, I think are major.
Stephen, I just wanted to ask a real quick question, interject on building on that same thing. How would you, because I know a lot of times from my prior experience, I was in technology sales. And when we would be approached by public government, a lot of the times they would receive a grant to purchase a specific type of technology. When prior to getting approved for that grant, they hadn't really done a lot of due diligence, exploration, investigation. Their IT department hasn't been involved in those conversations. They just know they want a grant, they're getting a bunch of money, and it can only be spent for this specific type of technology focused on this specific outcome. And they just sort of move forward with that. And while they will bring in their IT department, what would you say in terms of that? Because you brought up that they should be exploring other avenues besides maybe advanced technologies, but certainly underfunded and sometimes underutilized government, when they're given a bucket of money that they have to use for this, sometimes they're just gonna race for an RFP and race for a vendor to work with just to try and get it in place that year.
Yeah, so that's, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so what could you advise, would it be advisable to have a council set up to help advise them when they're making purchases with that kind of, weight or that kind of consideration, or what should governments be doing to prepare for that?
So that's a great question. I think that in the procurement process, as you mentioned, we often have legal counsel there just to, ensure that, it's legal, but that's like the base question, right? Like that's not really the starting point. I think that, if you could get some academics from your local university to say, hey, based off not only my expertise, but my connections with this community, here's what I see as potential issues. Having community members vote even on whether that they want this technology deployed in their community is really huge. I think that also I look at a lot of the funding that's been made available to schools for safety. And when I was speaking about face recognition earlier, one school district, if any of you are interested, it's a school district called Lockhart in New York specifically. They spent over like $1 million on a face recognition system that has not been determined to work. And I think that also in making the argument as to whether we should adopt the technologies, people think about the initial startup cost just to build the technology, but they don't think about the cost to maintain. And the fact that you're going to have personnel devoted to routinely kind of maintaining the system and making modifications and fine tuning and just ensuring that it maintains in that tip-top shape in a sense. So I think that number one, don't just think about what it takes to get the system running. Think about how do we ensure for the next 5 or 10 years that it maintains this essentially this robust and this very highly functioning route. But having people in the room when that procurement decision is made is definitely the biggest thing that I take from your question.
And another question that came in that I think also builds on this, the exact question was, how can cities hire good technical talent when private sector effectively pays so well? And I think that, hopefully Roger doesn't mind me expanding the question to kind of bridge to where you were just talking about with, well, if you know that, a local city or county is not going to heads up compete with Facebook, Amazon, Google in terms of price points, what are the other ways to create those structures so that that person is in the room, recognizing that a local, especially a small municipality, can't hire them away purely on the compensation basis?
So that's a great question. And I see that question posed a lot as well, as to how you navigate that the talent acquisition challenge if you can't compete with salary. And I think that the first part of that is going to take a reimagining of education. And I know that seems like I'm stepping away from it, but I'll bring it back in a second. In terms of legal technology, I was fortunate to go to law school. I started in 2016 and graduated in 2019, so relatively recently. But I went to the University of Miami, and we had a huge number of programs developed to introducing law students to technology. And it was there in like my first or second year that I was like, wait, I don't have to be just a lawyer in a sense. There's all these other things that I can utilize my talents with, and just working with like legal aids in the city and also the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. I found that, at the first part of my career, I'd be willing to take a pay cut to do great work. And I understand it's hard to pull people out of that once they're, 20, 30 years in big tech. It's really really hard to kind of pull them out. But I think that, not to get political, but I think that a lot of people are very motivated for positive change right now. I think that there's a lot of energy right now that if we capture and we channel that into positive projects, whether it be like, Code It Forward or Code for America and all these other different great organizations that exist to bring people together to have really great initiatives. I think you don't, like, everybody always assumes that you have to go straight into the full-time position. But I think that even if you're just like, a weekend collaborator, like, I think that that's huge. Like, I think that if you just to commit, like, let's say one project a year to, building the same way that lawyers devote some time to pro bono, I think that we'll have a much greater society in a sense. And so I don't think that it's not merely a method of just, say, poaching great talent from big tech and putting in the government, but it's one also having law students and technologists that are coming out today that are aware of all of these social issues and kind of the continuing harm from not having this in their education and having that in their talent pool. So I think that if we motivate the students of today, that within a few years we can have like a really great host of people across the country doing really great projects, really. So introducing more multidisciplinary work between different disciplines, I think, is huge. And then two, for people that are already full-time, getting them to commit to smaller projects is like the first step. And even if that's all that they can give, I think that's much better than nothing in a sense. So that's what I see as the ways that we can kind of attract greater talent into the government in a sense. And I think we also just need a reimagining of like civil service in a sense. I think that we've all been very exhausted the last 4 years in a sense. So it's vital that I think that we all kind of sit down and reimagine what we could do with greater civil service in that sense.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to ask a specific follow-up there on more of that civil service component and just thinking of how an individual can get directly involved. Say you're not that, AI engineer at a Google, a insert large tech company, or researcher at insert large educational institution, and especially some of what you were saying with the empathetic side and some of the other type, forms of intelligence that are very necessary for things to go well, especially for someone who's a non-technologist, what are ways that they can actually become a stakeholder in these kinds of processes, recognizing that the end result will impact them?
So that's a great question. I think that one, there's a huge wealth of information on the internet right now, and I think that one of the issues though is in terms of credibility, there's often like a little bit of a wall people feel that they have to scale, which you address kind of with you're not at a major academic institution. But I think that, online courses where you can get a certificate have like a huge wealth of benefit. In addition to you learning things, it tells people that like a base level. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to have a certificate to have their opinion be valued, but I think that when you come to kind of town hall meetings, for instance, and they're debating a new technology, it adds a lot of credibility and weight to your argument if you can come to it from a place of a little bit more like robust knowledge in a sense. And so when I think about the ways that people can interact in a sense, it's like I could just tell you to go to town hall meetings, but everybody's heard that in a sense, right? But I think that if you can band together and say, hey, I see a unique need in our community. I know that there's a way to solve this because other communities have done it, and they've done it for X amount of cost to this amount of resources. We have that here at our city. I think that you coming together and even just like sending a letter to your representatives of just outlining it, even if that's all you do, even if that's all you do, you identify an issue, you say this is how you would solve it, and this is how much money it's going to take. That is already like doing so much in a sense, just by voicing your opinion and making that heard. I think also like people get lost being like a spectator in an audience many times. I think that like creating an avenue where you just lay out a clear plan or a need, I think is very big. And of course, if you can get some signatures on that too, that's also very big. And I think that we're kind of in a crisis of leadership right now. So people are looking for the people in their communities at all levels and of the hierarchy to kind of produce new initiatives or kind of fly a new flag essentially to follow in a sense. So it's very vital, I think, that you're able to organize your ideas and present them in a manner that's relatively palatable to decision makers, unless you want to also become a decision maker yourself. And never neglect the importance and the influence you can have of local government as compared to the federal sometimes. Though that's really where you can get a lot done in a short amount of time with the least amount of constraints.
That's great. Thank you, Anno. And I appreciate that we got to, despite touching on some, potentially scary topics like the government use of facial recognition and surveillance more broadly, I'm glad that we got to end on a positive note of sort of regardless of what background or experience level you're coming from, there are definitely ways that you can get involved and affect positive change here. So yeah, Stephen, I just want to thank you again. In the chat, I just dropped Stephen's contact information again for anyone who might want to follow up and get in touch with him. I realize we are at the the 1 o'clock mark. So I guess any final remarks or parting thoughts before we let you go for the day?
Oh, no, well, thank you again to the PGHI staff. I think you guys are doing great work. And another way to, just get involved is events like this. Like, I think every city should have their own PGHI, just bridging that gap. So I really appreciate and value what you guys are doing with this entire initiative. And thank you to everybody that attended the call today. Thank you for the kind words that I see in the chat. I really appreciate everybody's time today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And I see Jen also posted the information for PGH.AI more broadly. So yeah, if you want to just follow us along, keep in touch for future speaker series or potentially even get involved and follow the newsletter, all of that information is in the chat. And yeah, please feel free to reach out to us as well and stay in touch. So yeah, thanks again, Stephen. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. Thanks everyone so much. We'll be in touch. We'll be announcing in our newsletter recording for this talk. So if you want to share with someone that you think missed out and would benefit from learning a little bit more, great. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Eugene, Stephen, for any questions you have about PGH.AI, as well as Stephen for anything around this sort of topic and subject matter. So thanks everyone. I'm going to close the room down. Have a lovely day and thank you so much.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
See you, Stephen. Bye, Jen.
Bye.